Welcome in, everybody, to the CFB Nation All-America podcast. My name is Bill Trocchi, senior editor at sportingnews.com, alongside Bill Bender, our lead college football writer at sportingnews.com. Thank you to everyone for listening to this podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And for those of you watching on our YouTube channel at CFB Nation, if you have time to leave a review on Apple, that would be great. If you have time to leave some comments and a like on YouTube channel, that would be great. Thank you to Irish Breakdown, your source for Notre Dame football information. They have a tremendous lineup of podcasts and great stories at irishbreakdown.com. You can follow Bill on Twitter at BillBender92. You can follow me at Bill Trocchi. And keep an eye on the main Sporting News account on Twitter at Sporting News. We stand 6 weeks from week 0, my friend. I'm thinking this is about a long par 5, maybe a dog leg. We cannot quite see the green yet, okay? But we know it's there.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy. Media days started this week, obviously, and then we get a little break there, and then we get ready for, week 0. Like you said, it's coming quick. All the predictions will be out. Sporting News has all kinds of preseason content out there, and obviously, as you're going to lead us in, it has been a very busy last couple days for us over there.
It is a busy last couple days. We are recording this Tuesday, July 11th. On Monday, July 10th, as probably most listeners to this podcast already know, Northwestern parted ways with Pat Fitzgerald after about a 30-year or so association with the school, 17 years as a head coach. Of course, he was a star player there as well. Unfortunately, there was a hazing scandal that he was caught up in. The school decided very quietly. It was very, very odd how they released everything. Before we get into the details of everything and the timeline and the reactions and where it leads, at what point did you go from this is an interesting headline to Pat Fitzgerald's career at Northwestern might be over?
Monday morning, I pretty much thought that was it. Once you read some of the details from the story, particularly hazing, and then, as we worded in what we put out at Sporting News last night, like anytime there is sexual misconduct, however small, especially in the Big Ten, that these schools and academic institutions have to be hypersensitive to it. And I think at the end of the day, it's a case of what stuck with me, and you brought it to my attention, was Pat Fitzgerald said he didn't go in the locker room because that belongs to the students or the players or whatever. It doesn't belong to the players. It belongs to everybody. And that's something that's kind of stuck with me. I had a high school coach at my son's practice telling me about that last year. And, that was at the high school level. So the fact that these allegations are out there, and yes, they need to be, it was enough. The allegations were enough that Northwestern is confident that they can fire Pat Fitzgerald with cause after suspending him despite a PR nightmare.
Yeah.
Hello?
So, the school originally heard about the allegations and launched an investigation in December. This is the timeline. I don't remember that story in the news cycle in December. I don't know if they did another Friday news dump like they tried to do just last week, but it was kept fairly quiet. They did a 6-month investigation. They came out on an extremely dead part of the college football calendar and concluded that there was, quote, the complainant's claims were largely supported by the evidence gathered. And they announced a 2-week unpaid suspension in the middle of July for Pat Fitzgerald on a Friday afternoon. That is, 101 for trying to bury the lead. And I'm sure people who support Northwestern were embarrassed by the initial handling of the situation. It took the Daily Northwestern, which I was thinking about this. So the school newspaper came out a day or two later and had all kinds of detailed allegations by an anonymous player, confirmed by another player. Eventually, it led to about 11 players confirming all of these stories. And I don't know about you, Bill, but when I was in school, I worked on the school newspaper. We did about 2 issues the entire summer. So not only is it just a great piece of sports journalism by these kids these students who are at Northwestern, they did it at a time when I'm guessing their publishing calendar is not really, on any kind of a daily or weekly basis in the summertime. So to break this kind of story, just hats off to those guys.
Yeah, I mean, it came at the right time too. It's been a tough week in the journalism industry for some sports writers, and for these guys to come out with those stories, the detail's incredible. It's and obviously from the Northwestern end, you've seen, if you try to see both sides of it, you see that Northwestern players and former players rallying toward Pat Fitzgerald. That happens in cases like this, but you've seen the student newspaper at Northwestern come as a position of authority, and the stories are well done. They're well written. They're well sourced. They're edited. Great job editing. And it shows the power of student journalism. It shows the power of local journalism too, quite honestly, on a beat like that. So props to them for sure. Now, what the next part of it, though, Bill, was that the athletic department went from that suspension to becoming rather reactionary. And once it becomes reactionary, and in the world we live in, these things move fast. And that's why I said, on Monday morning when we had our budget meeting at Sporting News, kind of said, well, yeah, he's probably going to get fired. And that's how I felt at the time.
Yeah, I thought, like I said, the reporting was terrific in the Daily Northwestern, and I thought the most damning part of their story, I'll just read the portion that I kind of clipped out of here, is they said, according to the former player, team members allegedly identified players for, quote, running, which was their word for hazing, by clapping their hands above their heads around that player. The practice, the player said, was known within the team as the Shrek clap. The Daily obtained a video of a player clapping his hands during a game, which the anonymous player said was the same motion taken to signify running. According to the player who spoke with the Daily, Fitzgerald repeatedly made the signal during practices when players, specifically freshmen, made a mistake. The player believes some players interpreted Fitzgerald making these signals as knowingly, quote, encouraging the hazing to continue. Everyone would just be looking at each other and be like, bro, Fitz knows about this, because you wouldn't take that action otherwise, the player said. Everyone joins in because he's the head coach. The second player who spoke to the Daily, who asked not to be identified, said he also witnessed these actions. So to me, I don't know, that stuck out to me. I don't know if anything stuck out to you in that reporting, but that was an indication to me Fitzgerald knew something was going on.
Well, and we're in media day season now, like I said, and you're going to hear the word culture said by every coach across the FBS over the next 3 weeks. They're going to talk about building their culture and maintaining their culture. And to me, those type of actions are indicative of, and I hate to say it, a losing culture. This isn't, look, I played high school football a long time ago, and I wasn't very good at it, but I played. And the way I say this is there was a locker room culture in high school at that time in the 90s that is probably far different than it is now in 2023. And kind of my point is, with NIL, with everything that comes with that, with how these programs have mirrored NFL organizations in some ways, that a locker room needs to be treated like a workplace. And the things that they were doing in the office, so to speak, are not acceptable. And there's no college kids will be college kids type thing here. If the coach is promoting those type of things, I had to look up running. I had to look up Shrek clap. I had to look up a couple other terms that made the Daily Northwestern that I'm not sure we're allowed to say out loud. So all of that is indicative of, I couldn't fathom that going on at some other programs in the FBS. And I honestly couldn't fathom that going on at Northwestern.
Now, yeah, exactly. To your point, I saw Reese Davis today, ESPN, and he was talking about if someone came to him 2 days ago and said, someone's about to get busted for a serious hazing scandal, I'll give you 5 names. He said Pat Fitzgerald would be nowhere near any of those names. He's got supporters from the left coast to the right coast, from the East Coast to the West Coast. Everybody thinks he's this great guy. He had this reputation of, I'd send my son to play for Pat Fitzgerald. And, Tim Brando came and said, I don't know if I believe these allegations. Danny Cannell, the media, said, I don't know if I believe these allegations. And I guess I would say to that is you all the things that people say in support of Fitzgerald, they can all be true. He's a great guy. He's a good leader. He knows, how to run his football program or whatever. And he does all these charitable works. And there was a letter by a former student manager that said how great he was. And he treated everybody with respect from A to Z in his program and all that stuff. And a lot of, I'm sure that a lot of that is true. You don't get that many people supporting somebody if that stuff isn't true, but that can also be true. And then he's making some bad decisions elsewhere in his program. That can also be true as well. So I think, a lot of times, needless to say, people see things as black and white. A lot of things are gray in this world. And I think this is one of them.
Well, for sure. I mean, I was the first to say with Pat Fitzgerald, I sat at his podium at Big Ten Media Day and been engrossed in his message that he gives to the players. He was great on the podium. He, first class, nice guy, answered all your questions, all those things. And, I would talk to other coaches and high school coaches and college coaches. And, Pat's a stand-up guy. That's the phrase you would hear the most. Pat's my guy. Pat's this. Former AFCA president. You don't get that among that fraternity without doing things the quote unquote right way. But that's another wrinkle in the story is when you saw the second Daily Northwestern story about the allegations of, inappropriate racial behavior and telling black players to cut their hair and cut their dreadlocks and doing things in a wildcat way. I think anytime I hear that kind of phrasing, like this is the way we do it, we play the right way or wildcat way or any of those things, that's not how that becomes a problem. You gotta be careful. Yeah, it becomes a problem within itself, doesn't it? Because, I know we do that with Alabama in the process all the time. You hear that phrase all the time, but Saban really hasn't changed the way he does things. But he evolves. He evolves the program. And I think Northwestern took a huge step back after 2020 on the field. And you can look at that part of it too as a cynic and say, well, it's easy to let him go, Bill. They went 4-20 the last 2 years or whatever that record is. I think it's 4-20. Not very good. And it's all layers to a complicated story that I'm wondering how much legs it has left, because what if this goes to court? I've thought about this one. What if Pat Fitzgerald goes to court with this and they find cause that it was a wrongful termination? That's the one I've been thinking about. I don't think it would happen, or I don't think it will happen. But what if there's a case where that does happen in college football with all the players transferring? What kind of impact will that have on the sport? It won't be good.
Right. And, even if Fitzgerald had no idea, which it's hard to believe, he brought all these guys in.
Right.
And they're the ones, they're the ones committing these acts that apparently have been confirmed and all that kind of stuff. And it's just, it's a shame. We haven't talked about the victims of the hazing yet. But, I mean, that's unnecessary suffering within the program because of a lack of oversight.
Right. Hazing is got to be outdated, retired. There are just other ways to do it. I think you may have been talking about this with me yesterday, or somebody was, that when you have freshmen coming up, you want them to contribute on the field. You don't want your freshmen feeling like crap and getting depressed and, dreading. I think, like I said, those days are over. Now there is being tough on young players and trying to get them prepared for the life of a college football player. I understand all that. And I understand that the other phrase that gets me, Bill, is when they say, well, a coach knows everything that's going on in his program. Well, not everything. It doesn't. Now, if this would have happened off campus, completely different story. Or like in an off-campus apartment or something. This happened in the locker room, allegedly. And that makes it a completely different ballgame.
And you hope that's not going on in other places around the country. I mean, it probably is. I mean, I can't say that there's, 68 Power 5 teams and only one's doing it, and 67 Power 5 teams don't haze at all or whatever. But you do hope cooler heads prevail, and maybe this will serve as an example that whistleblowers can be protected and hopefully feel comfortable coming out with stories if some, sexual assault / abuse stuff is going on in the locker room.
Well, and then you got to do it as a parent. Like, I have kids. Like, I put myself in that position where I was like, okay, if that was my son having that happen to him, I would, I wouldn't be happy. You've been around me. You know what I mean? Like it. And then when you hear like all the justifications for it, you just can't have that happen. And that's why I keep circling back to the make it like an NFL locker room. You don't hear about things like that going on in NFL locker rooms. It's, they get in, they get out, they do their press conferences, they go home. And that's what a college locker room, college facility is going to continue to evolve to be as we transgress down the NIL and transfer era. So, like I said, a shocking, stunning case. What's next for Northwestern, Bill? I would think, they have an interim coach. They're already speculating about Pat Fitzgerald's future. Before, as we came on, I've not read. Pat Forty had a column about the headline, and the gist of it is, will Pat Fitzgerald, where will he coach again and when? I'm sure he will, but it may be a minute, especially if this thing gets into a legal realm where, it'll become wait and see at that point.
Yeah, well, those are the two topics I wanted to touch on just a little bit. First of all, Northwestern. Bruce Feldman had a list of potential candidates. He feel like they have an interim coach and they will not hire a full-time coach until November, December. They'll take and we've seen that before. You saw USC with Lincoln Riley. They went through, a whole year or almost the whole year before they hired him. And, so they're looking at some names. I was surprised to see some of the names that Bruce put out there. I don't know if you have any, but he had 3 Power 5 head coaches that he thought might consider it. Matt Campbell, Iowa State, whose name comes up a lot. His stock has cooled a little bit after going 11-14 the last 2 years. Maybe he wants to get into the Big Ten. We'll see about that. Dave Clawson has competed very well at Wake Forest. He's 55 years old. Would he have an interest in going in and taken over after a scandal at Northwestern and a new and improved Big Ten? I doubt it. Mike Elko, same thing. Duke head coach. He's a younger guy, and he, has only been a head coach for 1 year. But he, again, you got to ask yourself, do I have a better chance to compete at Duke in the ACC or at Northwestern in the Big Ten? I don't know that they're going to get a standing head coach to take over that program, at least at the Power 5 level.
Yeah, of those 3 names, Mike Elko kind of popped just because of what he did at Duke. And he could probably do that. There's that whole, David Shaw's another name. He's out. Maybe he comes back. Who knows? Campbell's interesting. It is a Big Ten job. It's a Big Ten job.
It's a Big Ten job, but it's a Big Ten job. It's the worst Big Ten job with a huge uphill climb, replacing a legend, which you don't want to do, following a scandal, which you generally don't want to do either.
So it could be a coordinator type job. And their Northwestern knows what really dark days look like. When I was growing up, they were a perennial last place team in the Big Ten, and it was news when they won a football game. So not an easy play. Now they do potentially, they could have new facilities down the line. They have found a way to have success in basketball with Collins. They need to do things a little bit differently in terms of how they recruit and evaluate talent. They've had luck in the transfer portal. So those names are all interesting. Matt Campbell's another one that maybe that's his way back in the Big Ten. That's a guy that we were talking about confidently about taking the Michigan job a few years ago. So, yeah, like I said, Big Ten, a lot of money. They'll find somebody. But it wouldn't hurt. Like, the thing that worked with Fitz, too, was he had those Chicago ties. And that wouldn't hurt to have somebody do that, because the guy that's doing really well in Illinois right now is Brett Bielema. They've got some things figured out, and it can be done. And, maybe they got to model themselves in that way.
One Michigan name that popped up on his story was Sharon Moore.
Mm-hmm.
Michigan's offensive coordinator. And then a guy with Chicago ties that you mentioned, Mike Kafka, former Northwestern quarterback, 35 years old. He's the New York Giants offensive coordinator right now. Guys generally don't go back from NFL to college, but this might be a special case.
Well, I don't tell Vinny that. Vinny Iyer, our NFL writer, he was like used to stump that Mike Kafka would be a good NFL quarterback. Well, maybe not quarterback, but obviously a pretty good coordinator. And he played in some good games at Northwestern. That could be it. But, like I said, we'll see.
And then what do you think? What do you think about Fitzgerald? He's 48 years old. NFL has kicked the tires on him several times. I think if he joined a staff as an assistant coach, out of the spotlight a little bit, let things cool down, and then, figures out how to rehab his reputation a little bit, I think he still has a future in the profession.
I do too. And, we'll see where this goes with him defending his reputation. At some point, how it could play out would be, okay, he drops whatever suit, he admits to some wrongdoing. I think because of all those things we talked about earlier with his reputation, you saw it, how Twitter works at supersonic speed, where people were already speculating he'll be Nick Saban's next defensive analyst at Alabama, and that, and that's what happens. But Fitz will coach again, and it may take a minute. And I think it's just such, it's been 48 hours or so, but it's one of those deals where you question yourself as a reporter, because you're around him all the time. And I've told people for years, Fitz is a dude. He's awesome. And to have this happen, but I do hope that eventually he rehabs that image and gets another shot. Now, some people might not feel that way, and that's fair, but there are a fair amount of Fitzgerald supporters in his corner too. So that's why these stories are always tough. I don't feel the same way. Can't say it confidently. Like, I felt different about Art Briles and that scandal than I do about this one, and I think part of it is because of all that goodwill Fitzgerald has built up. But at the same time, there were victims in this, and they need to be answered for.
Well said. Well said. Well, that will wrap up part one of our 2-part podcast this week. Next one will be a little more lighthearted than the Pat Fitzgerald scandal.
Please.
We'll talk some over-unders. We will talk some Big 12 storylines. Thank you, everyone, to listening to part one, and stay tuned for part two.